I wasn't looking for giants. I want to be clear about that from the start. I was researching something mundane, something explainable. Cavalry tactics, specifically, the irregular cavalry units that operated in the border regions during the American Civil War. I was interested in how small, mounted units moved through rough terrain, how they communicated, how they survived the winter campaigns in eastern Kentucky. I had no interest in tall tales, no interest in circus sideshows, no interest in anything that would sound like folklore. I was looking at troop movements, supply lines, the logistics of feeding horses in mountain country where there were no roads. That's what I was doing. That's all I was doing. And then I found his name in a muster roll. The document was a transcription of Confederate enlistment records from September of 1861. 5th Kentucky Infantry. The handwriting was difficult, as it always is with these things. Names misspelled, dates uncertain. Occupations listed as farmer or laborer for almost everyone. But next to one name, in what looked like a different hand, someone had added a note. Not an occupation, not a rank, just 3 words. The Kentucky Giant. I assumed it was a nickname. Soldiers got nicknames. Men who fought hard, men who were tall, men who did something memorable. It happens. I moved on. I kept reading the muster rolls, kept tracking unit movements. But that phrase kept surfacing, not just in Confederate records, in Union reports too, in accounts from officers describing engagements in the Cumberland Gap region. One Union commander wrote that his men had encountered a man large enough to make 5 men with a fight of 50. That's a direct quote. I didn't make it up. That's what he wrote, and then I started finding more. And that's when I stopped looking at cavalry tactics, and that's when I started looking at him. His name was Martin Van Buren Bates, born 1837 in Letcher County, Kentucky, enlisted as a private, promoted to captain, wounded at Cumberland Gap, captured, imprisoned at Camp Chase, Ohio, escaped, returned to his unit, fought until the war ended, and according to every official source I could find, he stood 7 feet 9 inches tall and weighed somewhere between 475 and 500 pounds. I want you to understand how I reacted to that number. I didn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. 7 feet 9 inches is not a soldier. 7 feet 9 inches is a medical emergency. 7 feet 9 inches is a man who can barely walk, let alone ride a horse into combat, let alone survive a prison camp, let alone escape from that prison camp and return to active duty. The tallest verified soldiers in modern military history rarely exceed 6 feet 8. The physical demands alone would destroy a man of that size. His joints would fail. His heart would give out. He wouldn't live past 40. And yet here was a man who supposedly served 4 years of active combat, survived multiple wounds, escaped imprisonment, and lived to the age of 81. I started looking for the photographs. The first image I found was a cabinet card from the 1870s. It showed a man and a woman standing side by side, both in formal dress. The woman was identified as Anna Swan, a Canadian giantess, and the man was identified as Martin Van Buren Bates. They were standing next to furniture, next to doorways, next to other people, and the scale was wrong. Not slightly wrong, impossibly wrong. The top of a normal man's head came to somewhere around the middle of Bates's chest. Door frames that should have cleared his head by several inches instead sat level with his shoulders. The chair beside him looked like children's furniture. I told myself it was trick photography. That's what I told myself. Stage performers in that era used forced perspective constantly. They used platforms. They used scaled-down props. They used every illusion available to make people look taller than they were. This was Barnum circus, after all. Deception was the entire business model. So I started checking the details. I started looking for the tells, the grain of the print, the shadow angles, the compression of the background, the way light fell on different surfaces. If you fake a photograph from that era, There are always signs. The lighting doesn't match. The shadows point in different directions. The edges where figures meet background show artifacts. I spent hours with these images, and I couldn't find the tells. The shadows were consistent. The grain was uniform. The proportions of the background objects matched the proportions of the foreground. Either these photographs were created by someone with a level of technical skill that shouldn't have existed in 1870, or the people in them were actually that size. I found more images, dozens of them. Different photographers, different years, different locations. Bates in military uniform. Bates in civilian dress. Bates standing next to other tall people, who themselves looked small. Bates sitting in chairs that seemed built for a different species. Bates holding objects that looked like toys in his hands. And in every single image, the proportions were the same. The man did not change size depending on who photographed him. The man did not shrink when the camera changed. Whatever he was, however he existed consistently. And then I found the wedding record. Martin Van Buren Bates married Anna Swan in London on June 17, 1871. The wedding took place at St. Martin-in-the-Fields. Queen Victoria, apparently, was so taken with the couple that she sent them wedding gifts. Diamond-studded gold watches. Both of them. I found this in multiple sources. British newspapers from the time, American newspapers reprinting the story, even institutional records from Buckingham Palace gift logs where the couple appeared. In the registry of notable presentations. This wasn't a sideshow tale. This was documented by the British Crown. This was covered by mainstream newspapers on 2 continents. This was, by every measure I could find, a real event involving real people who were really that size. So I started asking a different question. If Martin Van Buren Bates was real, and if he was really 7 feet 9 inches tall, and if he really served as a Confederate cavalry captain, why had I never heard of him? Why wasn't he in every Civil War documentary? Why wasn't he in every history book? Why wasn't his name as famous as any other unusual figure from that war? The Civil War produced celebrities. It produced legends. Men became famous for far less than being nearly 8 feet tall and fighting for 4 years. So where was he? Where did he go? I started checking the institutional records. The American Battlefield Trust has a brief entry on him. Very brief. A few paragraphs. Basic facts. No analysis. No context. Wikipedia has an article. Again, mostly facts. Birth date, death date, military service, circus career, marriage, death. The tone is neutral. The tone is careful. The tone is the same tone you use when you're describing something you don't want to examine too closely. Martin Van Buren Bates was a Civil War veteran who later worked as a circus performer. That's how he's categorized. That's how he's filed. Veteran, performer, curiosity, move on. But the Guinness World Records has him listed as 1/2 of the tallest married couple ever documented. And the Library Archives of Canada has records on Anna Swan. And the Appalachian Historical Societies have fragments of his military career. And when you start pulling all these pieces together, you don't get a sideshow act. You get something stranger. You get a man who was measured and documented by multiple independent sources across multiple decades, across multiple countries, whose height was confirmed by physicians, whose military service was verified by both Confederate and Union records, whose existence was acknowledged by a sitting queen, and who nonetheless vanished from mainstream historical memory within a generation of his death. I started looking at how institutions handle anomalies, not conspiracies. I'm not talking about conspiracies. I'm talking about something simpler, something more human. When an archive receives a document that doesn't fit the narrative, what do? They don't destroy it. Destruction is rare. Destruction requires intent. What they do instead is categorize it, label it, file it somewhere that makes it invisible. Medical anomaly, unverified claim, decorative, miscellaneous, folklore, entertainment history. They acknowledge it exists. They confirm it's real. And then they put it in a box where no one will ever look. I found Bates's military records filed under unusual service histories. I found his photographs filed under entertainment memorabilia. I found references to him in medical journals from the 1880s, where physicians had examined him and confirmed his measurements, filed under historical curiosities. Everything was real. Everything was documented. And everything was placed precisely where it would never be taken seriously. This is not a coordinated effort. I want to be clear about that. I'm not claiming that someone, somewhere, decided to erase Martin Van Buren Bates from history. What I'm describing is something more mundane. Institutional habit, professional caution. The natural tendency of archives and historians to avoid anything that might make them look credulous. If you're a serious Civil War historian, you don't write about the 7'9" cavalry captain. If you're a serious medical historian, you don't cite the circus giant as evidence of anything. The incentives all point in one direction: acknowledge, categorize, move on. And over time, over decades, over a century, that pattern of small dismissals adds up to something that looks like erasure, even though no one intended it. But here's what started bothering me. Here's what made me keep digging. The built environment. I started looking at the house where Bates lived after the war. He and Anna settled in Seville, Ohio. They became local celebrities. They were known as the Giants of Seville, and they built a house. Not just any house. A custom house. A house built specifically for people of their size. I found photographs of this house. I found descriptions of this house. And then I started measuring. Standard door height in American residential construction is 6 feet 8 inches. This has been true since the 19th century. It accommodates nearly everyone. The doors in the Bates house, according to contemporary accounts, were over 9 feet tall. The ceilings were 14 feet high. The furniture was scaled to match. The stairs had deeper treads and lower rises than standard construction. Everything about that house was built for people who were not just tall, but proportionally larger in every dimension. And I thought, okay, they were circus performers. They had money. They built a custom house. That makes sense. Wealthy people build custom things. This proves nothing. But then, I started looking at other buildings. Not buildings associated with Bates. Buildings from the same era. Buildings that had no connection to giants or circuses or anything unusual. Public buildings. Institutional buildings. Courthouses and train stations and hotels and churches. And I started noticing scale problems. Doors that seemed too tall. Ceilings that seemed too high. Staircases with step heights that didn't match modern ergonomic standards. Furniture in museum collections that looked too large to be practical. I told myself I was seeing patterns that weren't there. I told myself that architectural styles change, that different eras had different aesthetic preferences, that the Victorians liked grandeur, that tall ceilings were fashionable, that oversized doors were status symbols. These are all reasonable explanations. These are all probably true, but they don't explain the wear patterns. I visited a courthouse in Kentucky, not far from where Bates was born. The building dates to 1852. It's still standing. It's still in use. And the main entrance has double doors that are nearly 10 feet tall. I stood in front of those doors and I looked at the hardware. The handles, the hinges, the kick plates at the bottom. And the wear patterns were wrong. The handles were worn smooth at 2 heights. One at a normal level. One nearly a foot higher. The kick plates showed scuffing not just at the bottom, but in a band that extended higher than any normal person's foot would reach. The hinges showed stress marks consistent with the doors being opened by someone pushing from a position that would only make sense if they were significantly taller than average. I measured the handles. The upper wear pattern was at approximately 6 feet 2 inches. That's the height where a man of around 7 feet tall would naturally grip a handle, accounting for arm length and shoulder position. The lower wear pattern was at approximately 4 feet 8 inches, standard height. 2 populations using the same doors, 2 sets of hands wearing the same handles, over decades, over generations. I told myself this was one building. I told myself this was confirmation bias. I told myself I was looking for evidence and finding it because I wanted to find it. So I went to another building, and another, and another. 18 courthouses, 12 churches, 8 train stations, all built between 1840 and 1880. All in Kentucky, Ohio, and the surrounding region. And in building after building, I found the same thing. Oversized doors with dual wear patterns, staircases with treads deeper than modern standards, furniture and storage that looked functional but wrong, proportions that didn't fit, not everywhere, not in every building, but often enough that I couldn't explain it away, often enough that the pattern felt real. And that's when I started looking at the old maps. Cartographic records from the 19th century contain categories that no longer exist, classification systems that no longer make sense, terminology that has been quietly dropped. I found a survey map from 1843 that included a notation I didn't recognize, a symbol next to certain properties. When I looked up the key, the symbol was labeled with a term I had never seen before. I won't reproduce it here because I can't verify its meaning. But it appeared on maps throughout the region, dozens of properties, hundreds of acres. And by 1870, the symbol had vanished. The same properties appeared on later maps with different classifications. The original category had been replaced, merged, redistributed, made invisible. I'm not claiming this proves anything. I'm not claiming this is connected to Martin Van Buren Bates or to anyone else. I'm only describing what I found. A classification that was ordinary to them. Strange to us. Something that was noted casually in official documents for decades and then quietly removed from the system entirely. Not hidden, not destroyed, just reorganized out of existence. And then I started finding the excavation reports. Between 1860 and 1920, newspapers throughout the Midwest published accounts of unusual discoveries. Bones found during construction projects, remains uncovered during road building, artifacts unearthed by farmers plowing fields. Many of these accounts described skeletal remains of unusual size. I'm not talking about the exaggerated claims. I'm not talking about the 10-foot skeletons that appear in obvious hoax stories. I'm talking about verified accounts. Accounts that included measurements. Accounts that named the physicians who examined the remains. Accounts that identified the institutions that received the bones for study. 7 feet, 7 feet 2, 7 feet 6. Documented, measured. Reported in mainstream newspapers. Covered as ordinary news, not as sensational claims. I found an account from 1876 describing remains discovered near the Ohio River. The skeleton was measured at 7 feet 4 inches. A physician from Cincinnati examined the bones and confirmed the measurements. The remains were sent to a natural history collection in the East. The newspaper reported this as fact, not as legend, not as curiosity, as fact. I tried to trace what happened to those remains. I contacted the institutions that should have received them. I searched their catalogs. I searched their archives. I found nothing. The bones were reported received. The bones were reported cataloged. And then the bones vanished from the record. Not destroyed, not disclaimed, just absent. As if they had never existed. This pattern, repeated. Discoveries reported. Remains measured. Institutions notified. And then silence. The newspaper accounts simply stop around 1920. Not because the discoveries stopped. Not because the land stopped being developed. But because the reporting stopped. Something shifted. Something changed. The things that were ordinary to report in 1876 became unusual to mention by 1920. And by 1950, They had become impossible to discuss seriously at all. I'm not claiming I know why. I'm only describing the pattern. And then I started looking at the tools. Museum collections throughout the region contain agricultural implements from the 19th century. Plows and axes and hammers and saws. Many of these tools are displayed with labels that describe them as decorative or ceremonial or presentation pieces. The implication is that they were made for display rather than use, status symbols rather than working implements. And for some of them, this is probably true. Wealthy farmers did commission oversized tools as trophies. This is documented. This is real. But not all of them show the signs of decorative manufacture. Some of them show wear, heavy wear. Wear in the patterns you would expect from tools that were used daily for years. Handles worn smooth by hands. Blades showing the marks of repeated sharpening. Metal heads showing the stress patterns of impact. These are not presentation pieces. These are working tools. And they are significantly larger than standard. I held an axe in a collection in Kentucky. The head was nearly twice the weight of a standard felling axe. The handle was over 4 feet long. The grip was worn in a position that suggested hands significantly larger than mine. The wear pattern on the blade showed a chopping angle that only made sense if the wielder was striking from a height well above my own shoulder. I asked the curator about it. She said it was probably a decorative piece. I asked why it showed so much wear. She said people probably handled it a lot over the years. I asked why the wear pattern was consistent with use rather than handling. She said she didn't know. I found furniture in the same collections. Chairs with seat heights several inches above standard. Tables with surfaces nearly 4 feet from the floor. Beds that were over 8 feet long. All labeled as oversized period pieces or Victorian decorative furniture. All showing wear consistent with daily use, not display, not ceremony, use. I found door hardware removed from demolished buildings, handles and latches and hinges scaled larger than anything in modern catalogs. I found kitchen implements with grips too large for normal hands. I found clothing and textile collections that would fit no one under 7 feet tall. All of it labeled, all of it categorized. All of it filed in places where no one would think to look, and all of it consistent with Martin Van Buren Bates. Here's what I started to wonder. Here's the hypothesis that I can't shake. What if Bates wasn't the anomaly? What if the anomaly was how we remember him? The official narrative is simple. Martin Van Buren. Bates was a medical curiosity, a genetic accident, a 1 in a million occurrence that happened to survive long enough to become famous. He was unusual. He was remarkable. He was singular. And because he was singular, he doesn't tell us anything about the broader population. He was just a giant. These things happen. Move on. But what if he wasn't singular? What if he was just the one who got documented, the one who got photographed, the one who happened to marry another giant and attract royal attention and live long enough to leave a record that couldn't be easily dismissed? What if the reason he seems so impossible is that we've been trained to see people like him as impossible, when in fact they were simply unusual, not common, not typical, but not unheard of either? What if there was a population, not a race, not a species, just a population, of people who were significantly larger than the modern average? What if that population was concentrated in certain regions? What if they built things to their own scale? What if they used tools sized for their own hands? What if they were recorded casually in documents that assumed everyone knew they existed? And what if, over time, through no coordinated effort, through nothing more than institutional habit and professional caution, and the natural tendency to dismiss what doesn't fit, we simply forgot they were ever there? I can think of counter-explanations. I can think of at least two. The first is that I'm experiencing confirmation bias on a massive scale. I went looking for evidence of giants, and I found it because the human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns that confirm what it already believes. The oversized doors are just Victorian grandeur, The worn handles prove nothing. The tools are decorative. The excavation reports were exaggerated. The photographs were manipulated. Martin Van Buren Bates was a singular medical anomaly, and I've wasted months chasing shadows. This explanation is probably correct. It fits the evidence. It requires no hidden history. It requires no institutional silence. It requires only that I was foolish enough to see connections where none existed. The second counter-explanation is that something else was happening. Something demographic, something environmental, something nutritional. We know that average human height has increased dramatically over the past century due to improved nutrition and healthcare. We know that populations can vary significantly in average size based on diet, disease burden, and living conditions. What if 19th century Appalachia, for reasons we don't fully understand, produced a disproportionate number of people who were simply very tall? Not giants in the mythological sense, just people at the far end of the normal distribution. People who would be unusual today, but who were merely uncommon then. People who built things to their own scale because there were enough of them to justify it. This explanation is also probably correct. It doesn't require any hidden history either. It just requires acknowledging that populations vary, and that what seems impossible today might have been merely unusual 150 years ago. But here's what neither explanation accounts for. Neither explanation accounts for the disappearance. If Martin Van Buren Bates was just a medical anomaly, why isn't he famous? Why isn't he in every Civil War book? Why isn't his story taught in schools? A 7'9" cavalry captain who escaped from a Union prison camp and was given diamond watches by Queen Victoria. That's not a footnote. That's a headline. That's a legend. That should be one of the most famous stories of the 19th century. And yet almost no one knows his name. If unusually tall, people were simply more common in 19th century Appalachia. Where are the studies? Where are the analyses? Where are the historians asking why? We have detailed records of height distributions from military enlistment data. We have skeletal collections that should show the evidence. We have institutional knowledge that should have preserved this information. And yet, when you go looking for it, it's not there. Not destroyed. Not denied. Just absent. As if no one thought to ask. The wear patterns on those door handles. The excavation reports that simply stopped. The classification system that was reorganized out of existence. The bones that were received and cataloged and then vanished. The tools that were labeled decorative despite showing decades of use. The furniture that was called ceremonial despite being worn smooth by bodies. The photographs that show no signs of manipulation. The documentation that was verified by physicians and queens and military officers on both sides of a war. I don't know what it adds up to. I can't prove anything. I can only describe the pattern. I can only tell you what I found when I went looking for cavalry tactics and stumbled onto a name I'd never heard before. Martin Van Buren Bates lived for 81 years. He served 4 years of active combat. He was wounded multiple times. He was captured and imprisoned and escaped. He traveled the world. He met royalty. He married a woman nearly as tall as himself. They had a child who weighed 22 pounds at birth, a child who did not survive. They built a house scaled to their own bodies. They lived as local celebrities in a small Ohio town. They were photographed dozens of times over decades. They were measured and documented and verified. And then they were forgotten, not erased, not suppressed, just quietly moved to the margins of history, filed under curiosity, labeled as entertainment, placed in the categories where serious people don't look. And over a century, that marginalization hardened into invisibility, until a man who should be one of the most remarkable figures of the Civil War became someone that almost no one has heard of. I keep thinking about that courthouse in Kentucky, the doors with 2 wear patterns, the handles worn smooth at 2 different heights, 2 populations passing through the same entrance, generation after generation, and now just one. I keep thinking about the bones that were sent to collections and never seen again. I keep thinking about the maps that had categories we no longer recognize. I keep thinking about the newspaper reports that stopped appearing around 1920. I keep thinking about the phrase in that muster roll, "The Kentucky Giant," written by someone who assumed everyone would know what it meant. Written in a world where that label was ordinary enough to not require explanation. What did they know that we've forgotten? What did they see that we've been trained to dismiss? What was ordinary to them that has become impossible to us? And what happened to the others? Because Martin Van Buren Bates was documented. Martin Van Buren Bates was photographed. Martin Van Buren Bates left records that couldn't be easily lost. But he wasn't the only tall person in Letcher County, Kentucky. He wasn't the only large man in the Confederate Cavalry. He wasn't the only one noted in those muster rolls with nicknames that suggested unusual size. Where are their records? Where are their photographs? Where are their bones? I don't have answers. I only have an accumulating weight of questions, details that don't fit, patterns that shouldn't exist. A man who was real enough to be measured by physicians and acknowledged by queens, but forgotten enough that I had never heard his name until I stumbled onto it by accident while researching something else entirely. 7 feet 9 inches, 475 pounds. Captain in the Confederate Cavalry, prisoner at Camp Chase, escapee, survivor, husband, father of a 22-pound child, local celebrity, Giant of Seville, and now a footnote so obscure that you can spend a lifetime studying the Civil War and never encounter him once. Someone decided that Martin Van Buren Bates didn't matter, not through malice, not through conspiracy, just through the slow accumulation of small choices. File him here, label him that, move on to something more credible, more serious, more normal. And maybe that's all this is. Maybe there's nothing more to find. Maybe I've spent months chasing a pattern that exists only in my own confirmation bias. But I keep coming back to those door handles. 2 wear patterns, 2 heights, smooth from decades of use. Someone was using those doors. Someone who wasn't average height. Where did they go? What happened to them? And why don't we remember? The file on Martin Van Buren Bates is still open on my desk. The photographs are still spread across my table. The measurements are still written in my notes. I haven't proven anything. I haven't found anything definitive. I've only found a shape, a shadow, an outline where something used to be. But I'm not done looking. Because somewhere in an archive, in a collection, in a storage room that no one has opened in decades, there are answers. Bones that were cataloged and forgotten. Documents that were filed and ignored. Objects that were labeled decorative because no one wanted to ask who made them, and who used them, and why they were so large. And I think, if I keep looking, if I keep measuring, if I keep checking the details that should reveal the truth, eventually, I'll find something that can't be dismissed. Something that can't be filed away. Something that forces a question that has to be answered. Or maybe I'll just find more patterns that lead nowhere. More shadows that dissolve when I look too closely. More evidence that I'm the only one who sees what isn't there. Either way, I have to know. Because once you've seen the wear patterns on those door handles, you can't unsee them. Once you've held a tool that was used by hands larger than yours, you can't unfeel it. Once you've read the newspaper accounts from 1876 describing bones that were received and cataloged and then vanished, you can't unread them. The Kentucky Giant died in 1919. He lived long enough to see the world change around him, long enough to watch himself become a curiosity rather than a captain, long enough to know that the things he had seen and done and been were fading into stories that fewer and fewer people believed. I wonder what he thought in those final years, looking back at a life that shouldn't have been possible. I wonder if he knew how quickly he would be forgotten. I wonder if he understood that within a generation, His height would seem like legend. His service would seem like myth. His existence would seem like something between a tall tale and a medical footnote. I wonder if he knew there were others like him who would be forgotten even faster. And I wonder what he would say if he could see me now, a century later, staring at his photograph, measuring his door frames, reading his muster roll, trying to understand how a man nearly 8 feet tall could fight a war and meet a queen and become completely invisible within 100 years. The official record says Martin Van Buren Bates was an anomaly. The wear patterns say something else. The bones that vanished say something else. The doors that are too tall and the tools that are too large and the maps that had categories we no longer use all say something else. I don't know what they're saying yet. I only know they're saying it, and until I understand, I can't stop listening.